What did the angels do when they saw Jesus on the cross? Imagine standing at the edge of history's most staggering moment. Not a scene written by men, not a spectacle of Hollywood lights, but the very hour when the Son of God was lifted high on a Roman cross. The sky darkened, the earth trembled, and humanity stood guilty before its own Creator. But pause for a second. Don't just look at the soldiers hammering nails or the crowd shouting, "Crucify him." Lift your eyes higher. Look at the heavens. What were the angels doing? Those mighty beings who had seen creation's first light, who had sung when the world was born, who had always cried, "Holy, holy, holy." What did they feel when they watched their Lord suffer? Did their hands tighten on their swords, longing to intervene? Did their voices catch, ready to thunder down in defense? Or were they silent, waiting on the Father's command? Friend, this question isn't just curiosity. It opens a doorway into the heart of God's love. Walk with me into that story. Imagine it, feel it, step into the moment when heaven itself held its breath. Because once you see what the angels saw, you'll never see the cross the same way again. Before we can answer what the angels did on that dreadful day, we need to pause and ask, who exactly are these beings? Too often our minds picture little cherubs on Christmas cards, chubby babies with tiny wings and harmless smiles. But that's not the picture Scripture gives us, not even close. The Bible calls them ministering spirits, sent out to serve those who will inherit salvation. Hebrews 1:14. Think about that, spirits. Yes, but more real, more awake, more powerful than anything we've ever seen. They are not decoration. They are not myths. They are God's loyal messengers, His heavenly army, His first witnesses. When Isaiah stood trembling in the temple, he saw seraphim with 6 wings, 2 covering their faces, 2 covering their feet, 2 for flight. And their voices shook the foundations of the building as they cried, "Holy, holy, holy is the Lord of hosts. The whole earth is full of His glory." Isaiah 6:2-3. Can you imagine pillars shaking at a single chorus? That is what Isaiah saw. That is who we are talking about. And this isn't an isolated vision. From Genesis to Revelation, the presence of angels is overwhelming. They appear at Eden, standing guard with a flaming sword. They appear to Abraham as travelers, announcing promises. They appear to Daniel in the lion's den, shutting mouths of beasts. They appear to shepherds under the Bethlehem sky, filling the night with blazing glory, always present, always moving at God's word. But here's something many don't realize. Angels, as mighty as they are, don't know everything. 1 Peter 1:12 tells us that even angels long to look into the mysteries of salvation. They are intelligent, yes. They are holy, yes. But they are also learners, students of God's unfolding story. They don't write the plan, they watch it. They wonder at it. They marvel as it happens. Pause and think about that. These beings have watched empires rise and crumble. They've seen the flood swallow the earth. They've seen fire rain on Sodom. They've seen seas split in two and prophets carried into heaven on flaming chariots. They are eyewitnesses of human history from the very beginning. And yet what was about to happen on Calvary was unlike anything they had ever seen. So when we talk about the cross, we're not just talking about an event on earth. It was a moment that stretched into heaven's courtrooms, a moment that silenced angelic choirs, a moment when even they, the watchers, the protectors, the mighty hosts, were forced to step back and tremble. That's why it matters to understand who they are. If the angels themselves were shaken by the cross, how much more should we, who are the very ones Jesus died to save? If angels are more than myth, more than decoration, if they are God's loyal servants, blazing with strength, then we must remember something vital. They have been here all along. From the first dawn of creation, they have watched, they have listened, they have learned. The book of Job pulls back the curtain for a moment. When the morning stars sang together and all the sons of God shouted for joy, Job 38:7, that was the birth of the world. Before a man ever walked the earth, before Adam breathed his first breath, Angels were already filling the heavens with song. Imagine that chorus. Imagine the sound of 10,000 times 10,000 voices thundering across the cosmos as God spoke light into existence. They were the audience of creation, the first witnesses of beauty, and from that moment on, they were woven into the story of humanity. They were there at Eden. When Adam and Eve were driven out of paradise, it was an angel who stood at the gate with a flaming sword, guarding the way to the tree of life. Genesis 3:24. That was no gentle moment. It was the beginning of exile, and angels were stationed as watchmen. They were there when wickedness spread across the earth and the floodwaters came. Angels saw Noah hammer together the ark while neighbors laughed. They saw the skies open and the fountains of the deep burst forth, swallowing an entire world. They witnessed judgment, but also mercy, one family preserved, one covenant carried forward. They were there when Abraham walked the deserts. Sometimes they appeared as men, sharing meals under a tent, announcing that Sarah would bear a son. Other times, they came to deliver fiery warnings, dragging Lot out of Sodom before destruction fell. They saw every promise spoken, every covenant cut, every altar raised. They were there in Egypt when plagues struck and Israel marched out free. They were there when the sea split in two, walls of water rising on each side, while slaves turned pilgrims walked through on dry ground. Can you imagine the view from heaven's vantage point? The Red Sea roaring like thunder, Pharaoh's army swallowed, God's people delivered. Angels shouted with joy as history bent under God's hand. They were there in Babylon when 3 young men were thrown into the furnace and a 4th figure walked with them in the fire. They were there when Daniel was lowered into the lion's den, and one angel shut the mouths of beasts until morning came. Daniel 6:22. For centuries they stood guard. They delivered messages. They carried out judgments. They shielded the faithful. But here's the truth. As much as they had seen, nothing had prepared them for what was coming. Creation was dazzling. Exodus was breathtaking. Prophets were courageous. But the cross, this was something different. The cross would not be a display of God's power alone. It would be a display of His heart. 1 Peter 1:12 reminds us, there are mysteries angels long to look into. Salvation is one of them. They don't taste redemption the way we do. They don't know what it means to be bought with blood. They don't know the feeling of guilt washed away by grace. And so they watch with awe, leaning in, eager to understand what God is doing for us. So by the time Jesus walked the dusty roads of Galilee, angels were leaning closer than ever. They had stood at Eden's gate. They had walked with Abraham. They had stood with Daniel. But now they were about to see the eternal Word made flesh. They were about to witness their Lord not in blazing light but in human weakness. For centuries they had been witnesses of history. But at Calvary, history itself would turn. And the angels would not just be spectators, they would be torn between heaven's silence and heaven's thunder, longing to intervene, yet commanded to hold back. For ages, the angels had known the Son as the eternal Word clothed in glory, enthroned beside the Father, worshipped without ceasing. To them, He was light uncreated, power without limit, wisdom beyond searching out. But then came the moment that startled heaven itself. The Word became flesh. Imagine the scene. They had sung at creation. They had thundered at Sinai. But when they saw their Lord take on skin and bone, when they saw the infinite God as a fragile infant in Bethlehem's manger, they were struck silent before bursting into song again. Luke 2 tells us, a multitude of the heavenly host appeared, praising God and saying, "Glory to God in the highest, and on earth peace, goodwill toward men." Luke 2:13-14. They could not contain themselves. The night sky blazed with their joy. But let's pause. Why such astonishment? Because this was something angels could never have imagined. The Almighty, whom they had seen robed in fire and majesty, was now wrapped in swaddling clothes. The one whose voice had commanded galaxies into being was now cooing as a newborn. The Creator of Mary was now resting in Mary's arms. That paradox alone was enough to leave the highest seraphim trembling. Theologians call it the kenosis, the self-emptying of Christ. Philippians 2 6:8. The angels had always known his power. Now they were learning his humility. They had known him as king. Now they were seeing him as servant. And this was only the beginning. They watched him grow in Joseph's carpentry shop, splinters in his hands, sweat on his brow. Angels who had seen him stretch out the heavens now saw him stretching a plank of wood. Think of the contrast. They followed him through his ministry. They heard his parables echo across hillsides. They saw his compassion for the sick, his mercy for the broken, his fire against hypocrisy. They stood nearby when he stilled storms with a word. They saw him raise Jairus' daughter with a whisper. "Little girl, I say to you, arise." Mark 5:41. They marveled when he called Lazarus from the tomb, death itself retreating at his voice. And yet, through all this, a shadow was growing. He began to speak of suffering, of rejection, of death. The Son of Man must suffer many things, he told his disciples, Matthew 16:21. The angels knew the prophecies. They had been there when Isaiah spoke of the man of sorrows, pierced for our transgressions, Isaiah 53:5. They had heard David sing of the forsaken one in Psalm 22. But prophecy from a distance is one thing. Seeing it unfold in flesh and blood is another. Imagine their emotions: awe at his miracles, grief at his rejection, confusion at his path toward the cross. They had always seen him exalted. Now they were watching him humbled. They had always seen him victorious. Now they would see him suffer. One moment captures it. The night of his birth, they announced glory to shepherds. But that glory was wrapped in weakness, hidden in poverty, lying in a feeding trough. For 33 years, angels kept watch, never once ceasing to wonder at this mystery, the Creator living as creature. And in their wonder grew a dawning realization. The humility of Bethlehem was leading to the horror of Calvary. The cradle was pointing to the cross. The incarnation was not the end of the story. It was the beginning of a descent. So the angels, who had been the loudest choirs in heaven, began to grow quiet. What lay ahead was not triumph in the way they had known it. It was something deeper, stranger, more costly, and it would leave even the angels themselves astonished. For 33 years, angels walked the shadowed edges of a mystery. They had seen their Lord crowned with stars, yet now they watched him wear sandals and dust. They had bowed before him in heaven's throne room, yet now they saw him bend low to serve fishermen, lepers, widows, and children. Every step of his human journey, they were there watching, guarding, waiting. They were there in the wilderness, when he faced the full force of the enemy's temptation. For 40 days, Satan offered him shortcuts, bread without hunger, glory without suffering, a kingdom without the cross. The angels must have bristled, ready to strike down the deceiver. But instead, they waited until their Lord had answered every lie with Scripture. And when the devil fled, Mark tells us simply, the angels ministered to him. Mark 1:13. Can you picture it? The King of Angels, exhausted in his humanity, strengthened by his own servants. They were there on the mountain of transfiguration, when his face shone like the sun and his garments gleamed white as light. Matthew 17:2. For a moment, heaven broke through. Moses and Elijah appeared, speaking with him of what was to come, his departure, his cross. The angels must have looked on with mixed awe and dread. Glory revealed, yet glory pointing towards suffering. They were there in the ordinary days too, watching him touch the untouchable, the leper who should have been cast out, now healed by a single word. Listening as he told stories of mustard seeds, lost sheep, and prodigal sons, parables that peeled back the layers of God's heart. Following as he walked dusty roads, slept in boats, laughed with friends. Angels who had only ever seen him enthroned now saw him tired, hungry, thirsty, truly human. And they noticed what others missed. They saw how he turned his face toward Jerusalem, knowing what awaited him. They heard the shift in his voice when he began telling his disciples, "The Son of Man must be killed, and on the third day be raised to life." Matthew 16:21. The disciples stumbled over these words, but the angels understood. They had been present when the prophets received these visions centuries before. Isaiah's suffering servant, Zechariah's pierced one, David's forsaken king. They had delivered those prophecies, and now they were watching them unfold. But there was a difference between knowing prophecy and witnessing fulfillment. To know the script is one thing. To watch it play out in flesh and blood is something else entirely. Every parable Jesus told, every miracle he performed, every confrontation with the Pharisees brought the angels closer to a reality they had never seen before. Their Lord walking willingly into death. They were there when he cleansed the temple, overturning tables, scattering coins, declaring, "My Father's house shall be a house of prayer." Matthew 21:13. The angels who had seen worship around the heavenly throne understood the fire in his eyes. They recognized this as holy jealousy for God's glory. They were there at the Passover table. They watched him kneel with a towel, washing the feet of his disciples, feet that would soon run in fear, feet that had already walked paths of doubt. For the angels, this must have been staggering. The hands that had shaped galaxies now scrubbing dirt off calloused skin. And then the words, "This is my body, given for you. This cup is the new covenant in my blood." Luke 22:19-20. Angels leaned close as eternity shifted. And finally, they were there when he prayed in John 17. That prayer, so intimate, so raw, was like a window into the eternal bond between Father and Son. "Father, the hour has come. Glorify your Son, that the Son may glorify you." The angels knew exactly what the hour meant. It was the hour for which he had come. The hour when salvation's cost would be paid in full. From wilderness to mountaintop, from synagogue to supper table, angels had borne witness. They had watched their king live as man, suffer as servant, love as savior, and they knew the story was about to break wide open. The night was heavy with shadows. The Passover meal had ended. The songs had been sung. The bread and wine had been shared. Now Jesus led his disciples across the Kidron Valley to a place he knew well, the Garden of Gethsemane. The name itself means oil press. And here, under the weight of the world, the Son of God would be pressed until his very life poured out. The angels followed. They had seen him transfigured in light. They had seen him calm storms with a word. But now they saw something altogether different. They saw his face bend low to the ground. They heard his voice tremble. "My soul is overwhelmed with sorrow to the point of death. Stay here and keep watch with me." Matthew 26:38. The disciples, weary and confused, soon fell asleep. But the angels did not close their eyes. They saw him stumble deeper into the garden. They saw his knees hit the earth. And they heard the prayer that shook heaven itself. "Father, if it is possible, let this cup pass from me. Yet not as I will, but as you will." Matthew 26:39. What must that have sounded like to angels? These were the same lips that had spoken creation into existence, the same voice that had commanded seraphim and cherubim for eternity. And now he was pleading with his Father. Surely some angels gripped their swords, ready to descend. Surely Michael, the warrior of heaven, waited for the command. 70,000 angels could have swept into that garden in an instant. Yet the order never came. Luke tells us something extraordinary. An angel from heaven appeared to him and strengthened him. Luke 22:43. Just one. Not an army, not even a legion one. Out of all the host of heaven, only one was sent. Think of that scene. Millions of angels straining forward, desperate to comfort their Lord, and yet heaven's silence hung heavy, broken only by the steps of a single messenger. That angel did not remove the cup. He did not drive away the sorrow. He simply came close, offering strength for the hour. And still the pressure mounted. Luke continues. Being in agony, he prayed more earnestly, and his sweat became like great drops of blood falling to the ground. Luke 22:44. Medical science calls this hematidrosis, when under extreme stress, capillaries burst and blood mixes with sweat. The angels who had seen seas part and mountains quake now watched their Lord's body break under the unseen weight of sin. What was that weight? Not nails, not scourges, not yet. It was the guilt of every lie ever told, every act of violence, every betrayal, every secret shame. It was the crushing totality of human rebellion against God, pressing him in the oil press of Gethsemane. And the angels, who had never sinned, who had never felt guilt, could only watch in horrified silence. Do you feel the tension? Imagine the hush across heaven's armies. Every angel, mighty beings who had never trembled now holding their breath. They had seen their Lord face Satan in the wilderness and stand victorious. They had seen him silence storms, raise the dead, confound the proud. But now they saw him bent in agony, begging his Father for another way. And yet hear the words again, "Not my will, but yours be done." This was the turning point. The angels understood then. This was not weakness. This was victory. Not the kind of victory won with swords and fire, but the kind won with surrender. They began to see what human eyes could not, that love was being perfected in obedience, and salvation was being purchased in submission. So they did not move. They did not rescue. They watched. They wept. They worshipped in silence as the Lamb of God stood and walked back toward his sleeping friends, his betrayer already approaching with soldiers and torches. Gethsemane was not the end, but it was the beginning of the suffering. The pressing of the oil had begun, and heaven knew the cross was now inevitable. From the quiet shadows of Gethsemane, the night erupted in chaos. Torches flared, swords clashed, and chains rattled as soldiers seized Jesus. To the angels, it must have felt unbearable. Here was the commander of heaven's hosts, the very one who had spoken galaxies into existence, bound by ropes like a common criminal. They watched him dragged through the streets, first to the high priest, then to Pilate, then to Herod, and back again. What irony! The judge of all the earth now stood in judgment before men who could barely judge themselves. Angels who had seen him seated on the throne of eternity now saw him standing, exhausted, bloodied, accused by false witnesses. Imagine their fury when they heard the cries of the crowd, "Crucify him! Crucify him!" Luke 23:21. These were the very people he had healed, the ones he had fed, the ones he had taught with patience and compassion. And now their voices rose like venom, demanding his death. What must the angels have felt? If one angel could destroy an army in the Old Testament, 2 Kings 19:35, what could 10,000 have done to that mob? Yet heaven stayed silent. Then came the scourging. Roman soldiers, experts in cruelty, stripped him and tied him to a post. Their whips were laced with bone and metal, tearing flesh with each lash. Angels who had seen stars ignite and oceans form now saw the back of their Lord shredded and bleeding. Isaiah had spoken of it long before. He was wounded for our transgressions. He was bruised for our iniquities. Isaiah 53:5. Prophecy was becoming reality, and the angels trembled as every word came true. After the scourging came the mocking. A crown of thorns pressed onto his head, a robe draped across his torn shoulders, a reed thrust into his hand like a mock scepter. The soldiers knelt in cruel laughter. "Hail, King of the Jews!" Angels who had bowed in reverence for eternity now watched humans parody their worship with scorn. Can you feel the weight of that humiliation? The true king was mocked by his own creatures, the author of dignity stripped of all dignity, and through it all, he stayed silent. Pilate, bewildered, asked him questions. "Do you not know I have authority to release you and authority to crucify you?" John 19:10. What irony, Pilate boasting of authority, while the real source of all authority stood beaten before him. Angels knew the truth. At a single word, Pilate's breath would vanish, and yet their Lord answered with quiet power, "You would have no authority over me at all unless it had been given you from above." John 19:11. The angels leaned forward. Would he call them? Would he end this farce of a trial? Michael the archangel, commander of heaven's armies, could not have been far from the front lines of readiness. 70,000 angels could have descended in fire, but Jesus did not summon them. He walked willingly into injustice. Think of that. The Creator judged by His creation. The lawgiver condemned under human law. The Holy One treated as unholy. For the angels, this was a sight beyond comprehension. They had seen empires rise and fall. They had watched kings parade in glory and crumble in shame. But never had they seen the King of Kings subjected to such disgrace, and never had they been forbidden to act. And perhaps that was the hardest part. They were not powerless. They were restrained. Their swords were sharp, their wings ready, their voices thunderous, but the command was stillness. This was not their battle to fight. This was His alone. So they watched. They watched as Pilate washed his hands in a basin, pretending innocence. They watched as the crowd roared for blood. They watched as Jesus was handed over to be crucified, and heaven itself must have groaned. The trial was finished, the humiliation complete. The Creator had been judged, condemned, and delivered into the hands of men. And the angels, mighty though they were, could only watch as history's greatest injustice moved forward. The trial was over, but the humiliation had only begun. The soldiers placed the heavy beam of the cross upon His torn shoulders. Every lash still burned across His back. Every thorn dug deeper into His brow. The streets of Jerusalem filled with a grim parade, soldiers jeering, crowds shouting, disciples scattered in fear, and the angels watched. They had seen the Red Sea part. They had seen fire rain on Sodom. They had seen mighty kings fall in an instant. But now they saw something they had never witnessed. The Lord of glory stumbling under the weight of wood He Himself had created. The Creator of trees now bore a tree on His back. Every step sent shockwaves through heaven. The soldiers mocked Him, striking His face, spitting on Him. He staggered, weakened by blood loss, until He collapsed. He could carry it no longer. And here is where the angels must have shuddered. They were not permitted to lift the cross. For all their strength, for all their speed, heaven's hosts could not touch it. Instead, a man, Simon of Cyrene, was seized by soldiers and forced to carry it behind Jesus. Luke 23:26. The angels, who had carried messages for millennia, could not carry this burden. It belonged to a man, for it was for mankind. At last they reached the hill called Golgotha, the place of the skull. The angels looked on as soldiers stretched His arms across the beam. The hammer was raised. Bang! The first nail tore through flesh and bone. Bang! Another struck, locking His other arm in place. Bang! His feet fastened to the wood. Each strike reverberated through creation. Angels who had heard symphonies of praise since the dawn of time now heard the metallic echo of iron-piercing flesh. The pain was unspeakable, but the shame was greater. Crucifixion was not just execution. It was degradation. Naked, exposed, mocked before the watching world, this was a punishment reserved for slaves and rebels. The Prince of Peace was treated as the lowest criminal. Angels, whose very nature is to honor their king, now saw Him dishonored in the most vile way. Above His head, Pilate ordered a sign: Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jews. The angels must have seen the bitter irony. Yes, He was king, not of one nation, but of all creation. And yet here He was, enthroned on rough wood, crowned with thorns, His hands nailed open in agony. Crowds passed by, sneering. The chief priests shouted, "He saved others. He cannot save Himself." Matthew 27:42. The angels knew how wrong that was. He could save Himself. With a word, He could summon legions. With a thought, He could turn the hill of Golgotha into ash. But He chose not to. And that choice was what confused and astonished heaven most of all. Because the truth was this: He was not saving Himself precisely so He could save others. The angels began to see it then. This was love. Not the love they had sung about in abstract hymns, but love made visible, love nailed in place, love refusing rescue. From the 3rd hour to the 6th, they watched as the sun blazed overhead and the Son of God hung beneath it. His mother stood nearby, her soul pierced with grief, just as Simeon had prophesied decades earlier. Luke 2:35. The angels who had announced his birth to Mary now saw her watching his death. Could anything tear heaven's heart more? Every moment on that road, every hammer strike, every mocking voice was agony not only for Jesus, but for the hosts of heaven who adored him, and yet they did nothing. Not because they were weak, but because their obedience was stronger than their impulse. They would not disobey their king, even in their longing to rescue him. So they stood invisible on that hill, swords sheathed, eyes burning, wings folded, and they watched. They watched the Son of God, raised high, not on a throne, but on a cross. From the 3rd hour to the 6th, the cross stood under a blazing sky. The crowd mocked. Soldiers gambled for his garments. Leaders hurled insults. But then something shifted. At the 6th hour, noon itself, the heavens darkened. Mark 15:33. The light vanished. The sun refused to shine. A heavy blackness smothered the land. The angels knew this was no eclipse. They had seen eclipses before, natural rhythms written into creation. This was different. This was the Father pulling a shroud over the world, as though creation itself could not bear to look upon the suffering of the Son. For 3 hours, darkness reigned. Think of the tension. The angels had never known such silence. In heaven, they had sung without ceasing, their voices blending in unbroken worship. Now, even their choirs seemed to fall quiet. They had watched kingdoms rise and fall, floods cover the earth, fire consume cities, but never had they seen the Father turn his face away from the Son. This was the part they could not fully comprehend. John 1:1 told them that in the beginning, the Word was with God, and the Word was God. They had seen that perfect fellowship, an eternal bond deeper than words. Now, for the first time in all eternity, there was separation. The Son bore the full weight of sin, and sin means distance, exile, abandonment. At the 9th hour, the silence shattered. Jesus cried out with a voice that must have torn through heaven, "Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani? My God, why have you forsaken me?" Matthew 27:46. Angels who had heard his voice command stars into being now heard him plead with his Father in agony. How could the one who had never been apart from the Father now feel abandoned? To angels, the words must have been unbearable. They had always known him in glory. Now they saw him emptied of all comfort, wrung out in despair. Psalm 22:1, spoken by David long ago, was now lived in real time. Prophecy was no longer ink on scrolls, it was blood and breath and brokenness on a cross. And the angels realized this was the true cost. It wasn't just nails, it wasn't just scourging. It was this, the Holy Son of God, drinking the cup of wrath to its dregs, feeling the infinite loneliness of separation so that no sinner who trusts him would ever have to. Mary stood at the foot of the cross, and the angels remembered Simeon's words to her, "A sword will pierce your own soul also." Luke 2:35. They saw it piercing now, as she watched her Son hanging between earth and heaven, his cries echoing in darkness. For angels who had been present at his birth announcement, who had sung of peace in Bethlehem fields, it must have been almost unbearable. And yet there was no command to intervene, no legion summoned, no sword drawn. Heaven itself trembled, but heaven remained still. The darkness deepened, and in that thick silence, angels understood something new. God's justice and God's mercy were meeting at the cross. They had seen justice before Sodom, Egypt, Babylon. They had seen mercy before Ark, covenant, deliverance. But now, both collided in one moment, on one hill, in one person. The cry of forsakenness wasn't the end. It was the doorway to victory. But the angels, watching from their stations, could only see the present horror. They could not yet glimpse the empty tomb. They could only endure the sight of the sun crushed beneath a weight too great for words. 3 hours of darkness, 3 hours of silence, 3 hours of separation so deep the universe itself groaned. And then at last the cross moved toward its final moments. The hours of darkness pressed heavy, and then suddenly light broke through. The 9th hour had come. Jesus, who had hung silent through agony, now drew one final breath and lifted his voice. It was not a whisper. It was not the groan of defeat. It was a cry that shook the very foundations of heaven and earth. It is finished. John 19:30. The angels knew those words well. They had heard him speak worlds into being. Let there be light. They had heard him speak life over the dead. Lazarus, come forth. But this cry was different. This was not creation. This was completion. Not beginning, but ending. A mission fulfilled. A debt paid. A victory sealed. And then it happened. In the Temple of Jerusalem, miles away from Golgotha, the veil was torn in two from top to bottom. Matthew 27:51. The angels who had seen that veil for 1,500 years now saw it ripped apart by invisible hands. Do you understand what that meant? That veil was no ordinary curtain. Ancient historians tell us it was 60 feet high, 30 feet wide, as thick as a man's hand. It was the barrier between humanity and the presence of God. Only the high priest could pass through it, only once a year, and only with blood. For centuries, it had whispered to mankind, "Stay back. Sin separates. You are not holy enough." But at the very moment the Son breathed his last, the barrier was gone, torn from top to bottom, not by human hands, but by God himself. The way into the Holy of Holies was opened. The angels who had stood guard at Eden, blocking the way to the tree of life, now saw heaven's gates swing wide. Access restored, communion renewed, relationship made possible again, and creation responded. The earth quaked, rocks split, tombs cracked open. Even death began to tremble. The angels, who had seen Sinai blaze with fire and the Jordan River halt its flow, now saw the very ground beneath Calvary shake at the death of its creator. Some angels must have fixed their eyes on the centurion standing guard. A hardened soldier, no stranger to blood, no stranger to crucifixions. Yet when he felt the ground move, when he saw the sky darken, when he heard that final cry, he whispered words that must have made heaven erupt in praise. Truly, this was the Son of God. Matthew 27:54. Imagine the joy of angels who had always known him as Son, hearing those words from human lips for the first time. But even in the victory, there was grief. The body of the Lord hung lifeless, his head bowed. Angels who had never seen death now looked upon their Maker dead. Can you imagine what that felt like? They had sung as he laid foundations of the earth, and now they stood silent as his blood soaked the dust. Still, they knew this was no accident. This was the plan written from the foundation of the world. Revelation 13:8. It is finished did not mean it is over. It meant the work is done, the price is paid, the way is open. And so, even in sorrow, angels began to see a new dawn rising beyond the hill of Calvary. The veil was torn, the debt was canceled, the law was fulfilled, and heaven understood. Nothing would ever be the same. The cry had rung out, the earth had shaken, the veil had torn, and then the hill grew quiet. The crowd, unsettled, began to scatter. Soldiers lowered the cross. The lifeless body of the Son of God hung limp, pierced, and broken. For the angels, who had never seen death touch their Lord, it was a moment beyond grief. Two men stepped forward, Joseph of Arimathea, a wealthy council member, and Nicodemus, the one who once came to Jesus by night. With quiet courage, they asked Pilate for his body. The angels leaned in, remembering the prophecies. Isaiah had written, "They made his grave with the wicked and with a rich man in his death." Isaiah 53:9. And now it was unfolding. The King of Kings, laid in a rich man's tomb. They watched as his body was wrapped with linen and spices, a burial fit for Israel's kings. They saw Joseph and Nicodemus carry him into the garden, to a new tomb cut into the rock, John 19:41. A heavy stone was rolled across the entrance, so heavy that several men strained to move it. To human eyes, it was final. To angels, it was unbearable restraint. Then came the irony. The religious leaders, who had mocked him as a deceiver, remembered his words more clearly than his own disciples. "After 3 days I will rise again." So they went to Pilate, demanding guards. The stone was sealed. Roman soldiers posted at the door. Angels, who knew the power of resurrection was already stirring, must have looked on with a mix of sorrow and almost bitter amusement. What could soldiers do against the plan of God? What seal could hold back the author of life? But heaven stayed silent. No angel descended to comfort Mary as she wept. No angel came to reassure the disciples hiding in fear. No angel rolled away the stone. Not yet. The order was still to wait. And so began the longest Sabbath in all creation. In the beginning, God had rested on the seventh day after his work of creation. Now, on this Sabbath, the Son rested in the tomb after his work of redemption. For angels, who had sung at creation's rest, this was a different silence, a silence thick with sorrow, yet heavy with expectation. Picture it: the halls of heaven without song, the choirs quiet, the harps still. The seraphim, who never ceased crying, "Holy, holy, holy," now hushed, watching the earth below. For the first time, perhaps, heaven's worship turned into waiting. On earth, despair deepened. Disciples hid behind locked doors. Mary wept until her tears ran dry. The enemy whispered that hope was dead, that darkness had won, that the cross was the end. And angels who had seen the triumph of God time and again, remained stationed, silent, longing for the command to act. It must have been agonizing. They had seen seas part in an instant, cities fall overnight, armies destroyed in a single breath. But now, with their Lord lying cold in a tomb, they were told only this: wait, do not intervene. Hold your position. Yet beneath the silence, something was stirring. Angels sensed it, even if the world did not. The stone was heavy, the seal secure, the guards alert, but none of it mattered. Heaven's King had said, "Destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up." John 2:19. His word had never failed, and it would not fail now. So the angels waited, wings folded, swords sheathed, eyes fixed on a garden tomb. It was the darkest Sabbath in human history, but they knew the silence would not last forever. The Sabbath passed, the night faded, and as dawn broke on the first day of the week, all of heaven stirred. The silence that had weighed on angels for a day and a half was about to shatter. The command finally came, the most glorious mobilization in angelic history. Matthew tells us, "Behold, there was a great earthquake, for an angel of the Lord descended from heaven and came and rolled back the stone from the door and sat on it. His appearance was like lightning, and his clothing white as snow." Matthew 28:2-3. Imagine the scene. After holding their positions in sorrow, angels now rushed into action. One was chosen, one messenger, to mark the moment that split history in two. Picture his descent, not timid, not hidden, but blazing. His face shone with the brilliance of lightning. His garments gleamed like snow under the morning sunday. The ground shook at his arrival. Roman soldiers collapsed in terror, and the unmovable stone rolled effortlessly away. Not to let Jesus out, the Lord of life needed no help escaping, but to let the world see he was already gone. For angels, this was vindication. They had watched him mocked, beaten, nailed, and laid in the tomb. They had endured silence while human hands sealed the grave. Now, at last, heaven's power erupted. The angel seated himself casually on the stone, as if to declare, "This obstacle is nothing. Death has lost. The grave is empty." And then came the women. Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James, and Salome walked toward the tomb with spices in hand. Mark 16:1. Their hearts were heavy, their eyes swollen from weeping, their steps slow. On the way, they asked one another, "Who will roll away the stone for us?" Mark 16:3. The angels must have smiled. The stone was no longer their problem. It had already been rolled away by heaven itself. When the women arrived, trembling at the sight, the angel spoke words that have echoed through the centuries. "Do not be afraid, for I know that you seek Jesus who was crucified. He is not here, for he is risen, as he said. Come, see the place where the Lord lay." Matthew 28:5-6. Angels had once sung at his birth, "Glory to God in the highest." Now they proclaimed the greater glory. He is risen. Think of the irony. The chief priests had demanded soldiers, the empire had sealed the stone, the disciples had lost hope, yet the very first heralds of the resurrection were angels. They became the first evangelists of Easter morning, delivering the news no one expected but everyone needed. And they didn't stop there. They gave instructions. "Go quickly and tell his disciples that he has risen from the dead. And indeed he is going before you into Galilee. There you will see him." Matthew 28:7. Angels had always been messengers announcing births, warnings, victories. But this was the greatest message they had ever carried. The grave is empty. Death is defeated. The King is alive. Heaven must have erupted in praise. The silence of the Sabbath was replaced by songs louder than creation's dawn. For angels, the resurrection was not just relief, it was triumph. Everything they had witnessed, the agony of Gethsemane, the humiliation of trial, the torment of the cross, the darkness of separation was now answered in radiant victory. And yet, their mission was not over. The women fled with fear and great joy, but when they told the disciples, their words seemed like nonsense. Luke 24:11. Angels must have shaken their heads. They had seen the tomb empty, the stone rolled, the glory revealed, and still human hearts struggled to believe. But the angels would keep proclaiming. They had been there when the Son descended into flesh. They had been there when he walked to the cross. And now they were there, blazing in light, declaring to the world that Jesus Christ had risen indeed. The grave had been broken. Death had been undone. And heaven rejoiced with thunderous hallelujahs as the Son of God stepped out into dawn. The stone had been rolled away, the grave left empty. The women had heard the angel's proclamation, "He is risen." Yet the story was far from over. Resurrection was not the final whisper. It was the opening shout of a new dawn. For 40 days after that Sunday morning, heaven and earth seemed to hold hands in ways never seen before. And through it all, the angels remained watchful, rejoicing, and ready. Picture the scene on that first day. The women stumbled back from the tomb, breathless, trembling with both fear and joy. They had heard heaven's voice. They had seen the empty grave. But when they rushed to tell the disciples, their words were dismissed as nonsense. Luke 24:11. Angels must have shaken their heads in astonishment. How could the ones who had walked closest with him be the slowest to believe? Yet the angels were patient, for they knew the risen Lord himself would soon make it undeniable. That very afternoon, 2 disciples trudged along the road to Emmaus, their hearts heavy with disappointment. To them, the cross had looked like failure, the burial like the end. But the risen Jesus walked beside them, hidden from their recognition. And as he opened the scriptures, explaining how Moses and the prophets all pointed to his suffering and glory, the angels surely leaned close. Imagine what it was like for heaven's messengers to listen as the Word himself explained the Word. They must have marveled as every prophecy fell into place, every shadow fulfilled, every promise shining with new light. When he broke bread and their eyes were opened, the disciples gasped in recognition. Then he vanished. Angels, who had delivered messages for millennia, must have rejoiced at this personal revelation. The Lord himself speaking, teaching, walking with his own, what they had longed to look into. Humans were now tasting firsthand. In the days that followed, Jesus appeared again and again, sometimes to individuals, sometimes to groups, sometimes behind locked doors. Thomas, the doubter, demanded proof, and in mercy, Jesus offered his scarred hands and pierced side. When Thomas fell to his knees and cried, "My Lord and my God," John 20:28, angels surely thundered in agreement. To hear from human lips what they had always known in heaven, that this Jesus is Lord, must have set their voices blazing. For 40 days, he walked among his followers. He ate with them, taught them, commissioned them. Angels had watched him feed 5,000 with bread. Now they watched him break bread with 11 fearful men, turning them into witnesses who would shake the world. They saw him reassure Peter, the one who had denied him 3 times, restoring him with 3 words, "Feed my sheep." They saw him promise the coming of the Spirit, the advocate who would clothe them with power from on high. And then the moment came. The angels gathered as Jesus led his disciples to the Mount of Olives. The sky stretched wide, the air still, with expectation. His words were clear, "You will be my witnesses to the ends of the earth," Acts 1:8. And then, before their eyes, he began to rise. The angels who had once seen him descend into Bethlehem's stable now saw him ascend back into the Father's glory. The disciples stood stunned, their eyes fixed upward. And in that moment, 2 men in white robes appeared beside them, angels, once more, stepping into the story. "Men of Galilee, why do you stand looking into heaven? This Jesus, who was taken up from you into heaven, will come in the same way as you saw him go." Acts 1:11. What a promise! The angels not only confirmed what the disciples had seen, they pointed forward to what they would one day see again. For angels, the ascension was not a farewell but a coronation. Their Lord returned victorious, scars in his hands, yet triumph in his stride. He had faced death, crushed it, and now he took his seat at the right hand of the Father. And the angels, who had once restrained themselves from rushing to his aid, now erupted in unrestrained celebration. The King had come home, and still their mission continues. They protect, they guide, they minister to those who believe. They wait with anticipation for the day promised at the Ascension, the day when heaven will split open again, and the King will return not in weakness, but in power and great glory, with all his angels at his side. For now, their story reminds us, the resurrection was not the end. It was the beginning of a kingdom that will never end. And angels, as they have always done, bear witness to every word, every step, every promise, until history's final chapter is written.